Recently, I window manager hopped once again. I switched to Bspwm. Bspwm is another tiling window manager. It's like the 7th or 8th tiling window manager I've lived on in the last year. It is an interesting sort of tiling window manager and how it's configured. It's really a strange sort of beast, and I've just recently moved to Bspwm, and I've just got over some of the initial configuration of it. So while it's still fresh and new on my mind, I thought I should make a video switching to Bspwm, my initial thoughts. Let's get started. So Bspwm, it's a tiling window manager. It is a manual tiling window manager. What does that mean? It means you determine the order of the windows, the placement of the windows, the layout of the windows manually. You determine that yourself on the fly. Very similar to i3, which was a manual tiler, and Luft was also a manual tiling window manager. Bspwm, again, manual tiling window manager as opposed to a dynamic tiling window manager. So things like DWM, Xmonad, Awesome, Qtile are what we call dynamic tiling window managers, where the layout of the windows is already predetermined. I don't have to determine exactly where that next window is going to open. All that's already predetermined. I don't have to decide it myself. So documentation, Bspwm, as far as I can tell, their homepage is just the GitHub page. There's not good documentation with Bspwm. It's one of the things I've struggled with these initial couple days trying to get Bspwm set up. Good documentation is kind of scarce on this window manager, unlike Xmonad, which has fantastic documentation. i3 had good documentation. Awesome had good documentation. Even Qtile had really good documentation. Not so with Bspwm. Their webpage essentially is just this GitHub page. By the way, Bspwm stands for Binary Space Partitioning Window Manager. What does that mean, binary space partitioning? Well, according to their description, Bspwm is a tiling window manager that represents windows as the leaves of a full binary tree. You want to see what that kind of looks like in a diagram. This is leaves of a binary tree. Basically, how the tree branches off, again, is determined by you because it's a manual tiler. So the order of the windows, again, is not predetermined. You decide. One interesting thing with Bspwm is it's a bit minimal. Now, when I say minimal, I don't mean necessarily lines of code. It's not suckless, So DWM and the suckless guys, had this strict lines of code kind of philosophy where they keep DWM under 2,000 lines of code. Xmonad is very suckless in philosophy as well. Xmonad is only like 5,000 lines of Haskell. Bspwm is about 12,000 lines of code. I think it is written in C, I believe. I could be wrong about that. I'm pretty sure it's C, though. But it's minimal in just the way you configure this thing. Let me pull up the config file here. So this is my current desktop, Bspwm. This is Polybar at the top. But let me pull up my configs. So I have already set a key binding for this little dmenu script I keep that's got some of my common config files that I edit often, and I went ahead and added my Bspwm RC file to the list here. And let me see if I can zoom in here so we can actually see what's going on. So this is my Bspwm RC file. Now I can tell you, by default, when you first install Bspwm, especially on a vanilla system like Arch in this case, there's not much in this file. You get a sample file. It's only about 10 lines or so. Most of this was not in this file initially. I didn't have any of this auto start stuff in my file, and I didn't have any of the monitor stuff in my file. And that caused me some real headaches. I had to do some reading initially as far as what needed to auto start, because when you first log into Bspwm without anything auto starting and without having the monitors set up correctly, you really can't do much. It's one of these window managers you kind of have to configure and know what you're doing initially before you get started. Otherwise, your experience is not going to be a good one. So I can tell you the auto start's pretty straightforward. It's basically like a bash script. So you can see I'm starting the SXHKD. That's the simple X hotkey daemon. that controls our key bindings. Bspwm does not control key bindings itself as far as the window manager. You actually have to go get a third-party program to set up your key bindings with. That third-party program is SXHKD. Well, that's a horrible name. That's a hard name to say. SXHKD. I think I still messed it up. Anyway, I've also got Compton Compositor starting on auto start. I've got Nitrogen restoring my wallpaper also on auto start. And then I have this panel.sh, panel.shell. That is basically my little shell script to start Polybar at the top. So that's my auto start program. It's pretty straightforward. The monitors, now I have a triple monitor system, and this was what was causing me problems because by default, the monitor line in the sample or the example BSPWM RC file was written with one monitor in mind, and it was really screwy because with just one monitor set in this config, and then I launch Polybar, the bar wasn't working right. It's one set of workspaces, but that one set of workspaces controlled one monitor, basically, but I had 3 panels on 3 different monitors. It was really weird. I knew something was not right away, so I had to go digging through some documentation about BSPWM, but I finally figured out however many monitors you have, 1, 2, 3, 4 monitors, whatever you got, you have to actually specify each monitor and the workspaces you want on each monitor. So I have 3 monitors. You see DisplayPort 0, DisplayPort 1, HDMI A0. So those are the IDs of my monitors. How do you get those IDs? Well, you can look at XR&R or you can look at AR&R and get the names of the monitors for your particular setup, and then give each monitor its own workspaces. They can be names, they can be numbers. I chose numbers 1 through 9 on each monitor. By the way, it's 1 through 9 on this monitor, and then the second monitor also has 1 through 9 workspaces, but they're a different 1 through 9. They don't share the same workspaces. So technically I have 27 workspaces. 1 through 9 on monitor 1, 1 through 9 on monitor 2, 1 through 9 on monitor 3. Now that, once again, is very similar to something like DWM or Awesome Window Manager. That's kind of the way they handled multi-monitors, as opposed to the way Xmonad and Qtile handle multi-monitors, where you have a set of workspaces, they're shared between all your monitors, no matter how many monitors you have. I kind of prefer the way Xmonad and Qtile do that, but I don't mind this setup either. I'm fine either way. So this is a pretty straightforward config. It's basically almost like a bash script in some ways. The syntax is pretty easy to learn. This is not a hard config file to set up. It's just initially the example script you get is pretty bare. It's only just a handful of lines, and you're going to need to add a lot more lines to this script to be effective. And again, it's not great documentation on BSPWM, but I finally got this set to the way I like it. You can see I have BSPC config border width. Now BSPC is a specific program that is installed with BSPWM that takes care of some stuff. Don't worry about that, but you call on this particular program BSPC. So config border width, config window gap, config top padding, config bottom padding, etc. So as you probably guess, this determines the padding around the windows here. It also determines the gap between the windows. So if I hit super enter right now to open another terminal window, you can see I have a gap between the windows. It's because I set window gap to be 10 pixels. If I open another one, you can see I have 10 pixel gap between the windows, and then I have top padding set to 20 here. And what that is it leaves a padding at the very top of the windows for 20 pixels. That's so it doesn't cover my panel, my polybar at the top. It's very important you do that. Otherwise, you're not going to see whatever panel or dock or whatever you're working with. Your windows are just going to cover everything. By the way, while I'm opening windows, let me continue opening windows, because these first 3 windows, you would almost think this is your typical master and stack layout, where you got the one big window and then everything else is stacked on the right hand side. But if I open one more window, you see it splits that. And then I open another one, it splits that. Now I open another one, it splits that. And you keep splitting. It just dwindles almost into that direction there. That's just the default layout for BSPWM. If you don't want to do the manual thing, that's how it will do it dynamically, I guess. That's the dynamic layout. Now, if you wanted to do this manually, I think you can select with the super key. You could do, actually, I think it's super control and then whatever direction you want to go with the Vim key. So L would be left. And you see, I get this highlighted area to the left. Now, open whatever program you want to open, and that's where it opens. So again, super control and J for down. You see, I've selected that area for the next window, and I can open the next window. I could super control and H for that way to the left. And then boom. And then super shift C, I think I set for closing all my windows. And now some of these key bindings, these are not like default key bindings really. You kind of have to create your own key bindings with Bspwm. How do you do that? I mentioned Bspwm doesn't control key bindings at all. In my auto start, you see SXHKD. That's the simple X hotkey Daemon. So you have to install that program with Bspwm, and then you need to edit your SXHKD.rc file. So once again, I'm going to launch my dmenu script that's got all my config files in it that I commonly edit, and I do have my SXHKD.rc file in this. So let me open that up, and once again I will zoom in here so you guys can see what's going on. Now the syntax for this is pretty straightforward. Super plus return, you know, and then on the next line I tab over and whatever command I want super plus return to run. ST, which is my terminal. Super shift plus return, it opens dmenu. That's what my default for opening dmenu. So pretty straightforward. Super plus alt plus Q or R runs this command, BSPC, and then either quit or restart the window manager, depending on if it's Q or if it's R. Pretty straightforward syntax. I actually didn't mind doing this. The only thing is it's tedious. Setting up your Bspwm.rc file is tedious. Setting up the SXHKD.rc file is also tedious because by default, these files are completely bare. I mean, just a few lines, and you have to do everything yourself. And I'm not even close to having this configured the way I really want it. But I've gotten it to the point that it's usable. Like I can live in it right now. You know, as long as I can get to a terminal, I can get dmenu open. I have a few basic hotkeys set for quitting or closing a program, quitting out of the window manager, restarting the window manager. And because it's very bash script like, you know, it's not a hard config file. It's not like the xmonad config file, which is written in Haskell. I mean, it's pretty straightforward, but again, it's tedious. You know, there's a lot to it. You know, it doesn't have its own panel. You got to decide, do you want to use a panel? If you do use a panel, which panel do you want to use? Then you got to configure that panel to work with Bspwm. Again, didn't even come with its own way to handle hotkeys. You have to install a third-party program to handle hotkeys. Then, of course, you got to make sure that you launch a compositor if you want compositing, how you're going to set your wallpaper, etc., etc. So, again, very, very minimal, very basic out of the box. So a little bit of what I've got set up already. I'm going to close my Bspwm.rc file because once you get that kind of set up, you really don't edit it much. It's the SXHKD.rc file that you're going to edit all the time because that's the hotkeys, right? That's the key bindings. And some of what I've got in here is pretty straightforward. For example, changing from tiling to floating to full screen, whatever mode you want, I've got that right here. Set the window state. So if I wanted, instead of being in tiled mode right now, which is what I'm in, what if I wanted to go into floating mode? Well, I would go super plus F, it looks like. So if I go super F, a super F is full screen. My bad. So super F makes this terminal window full screen. If I super T, I go back to tiling mode. So that's pretty neat. Super S goes into what they call pseudo tiled mode, where it's basically a floating mode where you can drag it and, you know, resize it. If I want to get back into tiled mode, super T gets me back into tiled mode. Super F, full screen. Super S, back to that pseudo tiled floating mode. So I actually really like that. It's pretty easy to switch between the various modes. Some other things here in the config file, it's pretty easy to move windows from one monitor to the next. So by default, of course, you know, the workspaces on monitor 1 are different than the workspaces on monitor 2, are different than the workspaces on monitor 3. But if you have a window on some workspace on monitor 3, you can move that window to monitor 2 or monitor 1 to those sets of workspaces with some hotkeys. It looks like what super control plus the Vim keys, you know, will let you move those windows in whatever direction of monitors you've got. And you can also, looks like, expand the size of the windows. You see, expand a window by moving one of its sides outwards. Super Alt plus the Vim key, so you could resize some windows. So I'm in tiled mode right now. I don't know if resizing the windows actually works in tiled mode, but if I do Super Alt and then, I don't know, H or J or K, no, it doesn't look like that works in tiled mode. Let me switch to pseudo tiled mode. And now Super Alt H. Oh yeah, that actually, it changes the direction. It actually shifted focus from that window to the other monitor. That's kind of neat. Actually, the controls and everything are pretty straightforward once you get this config file set up. Now, by default, none of this is going to be in this config file. What I had to do is I had to go grab some configs off of GitHub and GitLab. Basically, I found 2 or 3 different Bspwm RC files and 2 or 3 different SXHKD RC files, and I picked a little bit of stuff from each one, things that I thought I would like. In particular, I went and took a look at Arco Linux. Arco Linux has a Bspwm edition. I don't have it currently installed, but I was able to find their configs over on GitHub. I believe they use GitHub. And I took some of what they were doing, what the Arco Linux team were doing with Bspwm. I kind of liked their configs, so I used much of what was in their config files. So that's basically, you know, an initial setup for me anyway of Bspwm. I'm pretty happy with it so far. Again, it wasn't the most straightforward to set up. You know, this is not Awesome Window Manager. Awesome Window Manager is very easy to set up for the new user because out of the box, the default configs actually work. Qtile is very similar in that aspect as well. A new user can get up and running with Qtile very quickly. Xmonad is not easy for the new user. You have to actually write a config file right away for Xmonad for it to be usable. Bspwm is kind of like that as well, maybe even more so actually than Xmonad, because by default, you really can't do anything with Bspwm. Really, if you're on a multi-monitor system, you can't do anything until you get that Bspwm RC file straightened out and, you know, the number of workspaces you want on each monitor and the names of each monitor and all that. Until you get that, you're really, you're not going to be happy. It's not going to be a usable desktop experience until you get some of that straightened out. But once you get it straightened out, so far I kind of like it. It's a responsive tiling window manager. I've never seen a slow tiling window manager, but it's pretty peppy, and I kind of like the workflow. The manual mode, you know, determining where the windows appear is okay, but typically I just use that default kind of Fibonacci sort of layout that it does. Typically, I never open more than about 2 or 3 windows on a monitor anyway, so I don't worry about the windows becoming smaller and smaller. I rarely open more than 3 windows on one monitor anyway. Typically, 2 is usually the max. So I'm going to stick with Bspwm. I'm going to keep configuring it, keep, you know, playing with it, and if I feel like there's something I discover and I need to share it with you guys on camera, I may do some more videos on it. I probably stay on this window manager for a month. That's typically what I aim for. I try to, when I switch to these things, I want to live in them at least 30 days just to really get the feel of them. And then after that, who knows? I'm not sure where I go from here. I think I'm going to quit window manager hopping after this. I've been window manager hopping the entire year of 2019. This calendar year, I started January 1st, window manager hopping. And I think after Bspwm is done, I'm going to quit doing that for a while. I'm just going to pick one of these window managers that I really like, and there's several that I really like, and I'm just going to live in them a little bit more long term, maybe 6 months, a year, just to, you know, quit hopping as much, because I think the hopping, I'm not getting the most out of any of these window managers, only staying on them a month at a time. It's great for the channel because I get to share more window managers with you, but me personally, I don't think I really harness the full power of any of these window managers, because I think sometimes you have to live on something 6 months at least, a year. It would be even better to really know every nook and cranny, all the ins and outs of a particular program. So I'm going to stay on Bspwm for about 30 days. After that, we'll see. Before I go, this show was made possible by Ansem, Chris, the other Chris, Dylan, George, Mitchell, Natek, Philip, Rob, Robert, Sam, and Willie. They are the producers of the show. They're my highest tiered patrons over on Patreon. Without these guys, this show about me switching to Bspwm, it wouldn't have been possible. Also brought to you by all those fine ladies and gentlemen, all those names you see on the screen that help support my work over on Patreon. Again, without each and every one of those guys, this show would not be possible. Sincere thank you to each and every one of you guys, and if you'd like to support the channel, please consider doing so. You'll find me at DistroTube over on Patreon. Alright guys, peace.